Hi, so remember I said last lecture that whether ethical egoism was true, that the only good argument for it was going to come down to psychological egoism, right? Psychological egoism being this claim about human nature. Psychological egoism saying people are selfish or self-interested. Well, but look, I think it's good to be clear what we mean by psychological egoism, because we can mean, when we say people are selfish or self-interested, we can mean a lot of different things. We can actually, you know, for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to, split it into two broad camps. There's a lot of things you could mean. And the two broad camps I'm going to split it into, though, are weak psychological egoism or strong psychological egoism. And I want to talk about, I think it's very good that we be clear on these two forms of psychological egoism. I want to ask, are either of them true? And also, how important are either of them? And, just to tip my cards to y'all a bit, I actually think that weak psychological egoism, one here, weak psychological egoism, I think is true. At least in some form, it's probably true. Strong psychological egoism, I think, is false. And I'll give y'all reasons for thinking it's false at the end of the lecture. Here's the thing, though. I think a lot of times people slide between these. They'll give an argument or they'll give reasons to think weak psychological egoism's true, then they'll slide into strong psychological egoism. That's a classic example of this fallacy of equivocation, though, right? Just because weak psychological egoism is true doesn't mean strong psychological egoism is true. And here's something else, and I will talk a bit more about this. I actually think that strong psychological egoism is the only one of these two that's actually interesting. Weak psychological egoism, even if it's true, it might not turn out to be all that interesting or important. Okay, but let's see why. Let me talk what I mean by each of these forms of egoism. Let me explain, what the evidence for and against each is, and why I think only strong psychological egoism is interesting, but also why I think it's false. Okay, weak psychological egoism is a claim about how people often or usually act. Weak psychological egoism will say people often act from self-interest, or maybe even they usually act from self-interest. Well, is that true? Well, look, I'm going to guess some of you guys would, if this were an in-person class, you'd probably say, well, often is a different word from usually, so you got to narrow this down, tell me what you mean by weak psychological egoism, and I take your point. Even weak psychological egoism, there might be different forms of it. It might mean different things. But, we don't actually need to slice things that thin. We don't need to be that precise. Just, if we say people often, usually act from self-interest, that'll be good enough, right, for our purposes. And I think those sorts of claims are probably true, right? Look, if you ask somebody why they did something, a lot of times you're going to get an answer that appeals to self-interest, right? If I ask each of y'all why you took this class, a lot of you would give me self-interested reasons, right? I want to earn more money at my job. I'm, even something like, well, I'm bored and I thought this would be interesting. That's a self-interested reason, right? If I ask you a reason for a lot of the things you do, I would get a self-interested reason, right? Why do you get a cup of coffee? Because I really enjoy coffee. I think it's delicious. Well, okay then. So, weak psychological egoism, at least in some form, seems to be true. Well, but let's ask ourselves this. Is it interesting? Not only is it interesting, will it be enough to make the argument I gave you guys for ethical egoism work? I think the answer on both counts is no. Let's go back. Let me remind you guys of the argument. The argument was, you know, to say that someone should do something requires that they can do it. So any good ethical theory shouldn't ask us to do something that's impossible. Then we get to premise 3, which is the key one here. Human beings can only act from self-interest. So any good ethical theory must appeal to our self-interest. That is, it must be a form of ethical egoism. Well, but think. Premise 3 is human beings can only act from self-interest. Well, is weak psychological egoism enough to show that's true? Think back to what weak psychological egoism is. Weak psychological egoism says people often or usually act from self-interest. It doesn't say that people can only act from self-interest. Doesn't say they always act from self-interest. So even if weak psychological egoism were true, and I think it isn't enough to make this argument for ethical egoism work. And look, let me tell you guys, I don't even think you should be that worried about the fact that weak psychological egoism is true, right? Look, the fact is that in some cases, there's a conflict between morality and self-interest. In a lot of cases, in fact, most cases, there isn't, right? You want to get a cup of coffee for lunch because you enjoy it, that's a self-interested reason, but unless I'd really tell some weird story, morality just isn't even involved there, right? Or think about taking this class because you want to earn more money. In that case, self-interested reason, but there's no reason to think it's against morality, right? Moral reasons, let's say you want to provide better for your family maybe, might even line up with the self-interested reasons you want to have more money to spend on yourself. So look, it can be perfectly true that we're often self-interested, and also true that morality asks us to give up our self-interest, and we can do it if we want to. So weak psychological egoism, true, but really unimportant, really kind of boring, right? Well, let's talk about strong psychological egoism then. So strong psychological egoism claims that people can only act from self-interest. It's a claim about human nature. It says, well, look, human beings are such, we are set up in a way that we can only act for selfish reasons. And now look, if strong psychological egoism were true, it would make the argument we looked at work, right? Strong psychological egoism says people can only act for self-interested reasons. Well, that's premise 3, right? Strong psychological egoism makes the argument work. Well, but then the question is, do we have any good evidence to think that strong psychological egoism is true? And I don't think that we do. Look, what would you have to show that people always act in self-interest? Well, now you might say, well, look, people won't do something unless they see something in it, right? If you don't see something in it, if you don't, if you're just not, somebody might say something like, if there's not something in it for you, you won't do it. But think about, what do you mean by that, right? I think it's perfectly true that people always have reasons for what they do. But those aren't always obviously self-interested reasons, right? If I'm watching TV one night and I hear about some horrible tragedy, and I decide, oh my goodness, I should write a check to the Red Cross so they can help with this, and I write a check for $50. Well, I have to see a reason for doing that. I want to help these people. That's not a selfish reason, though, is it, right? I mean, selfish reason would be, if I had selfish reasons, I wouldn't even write the check, right? Or I would only write the check if, I could impress somebody, right? And think about this too, right? Not only is it hard to find evidence for strong psychological egoism, there's a lot of evidence against. People pretty clearly do stuff that's not in their self-interest, or at least they seem to, right? Just to cut to the chase and give you maybe the clearest example I can think of, think about these people who win the Congressional Medal of Honor, right? If you guys don't know what it is, it's really hard to get. Usually the kinds of things that soldiers do to get the Congressional Medal of Honor, well, they end up dying in doing it, right? Think about stuff like that. Heroics in war, right? Somebody leaps onto a grenade to save the other men in his unit and gets blown up. Tell me how in the world that's self-interest, right? Now look, somebody might say, and I think usually somebody at this point will say, well, people only do these selfless, unselfish things because they don't want to feel guilty or they want to feel good about themselves, right? Now, I'd say two things about that. One, think about my case of someone hopping on a grenade. That's a really bad interpretation. That's a really hard to swallow interpretation of what's going on there. Does this person really care so much about the 3 or 4 seconds of feeling like a hero he's going to get before he gets blown up that that's enough reason to sacrifice his life, right? To say that this is selfishly motivated, to say this is motivated by self-interest, that's just really hard to swallow. And you might say, well, he just thought that if he didn't do it, he'd feel guilty the rest of his life. That's hard to swallow too, right? Most people would get over it. But also think of this, right? If I give money to charity, and you say to me, well, you only did it so you wouldn't feel guilty, or you'd feel good about yourself when you wrote that check. Think about it this way, though, right? If I were truly a selfish person, if I only acted for selfish reasons, I wouldn't feel guilty, would I? And I wouldn't feel good about giving the money. If I could only act for selfish reasons, I might hear about a disaster half a world away and think to myself, that stinks to be them. Or, yeah, I'm glad I'm not them. Or, why are they interrupting my favorite TV show to talk about this, right? If we were really egoists, if strong psychological egoism were true, we wouldn't feel guilt, and we wouldn't feel, for doing the morally wrong thing when it's in our self-interest, and we wouldn't feel pride for helping people out or doing the morally right thing, right? So all of that seems like good evidence against strong psychological egoism. Now look, I will admit this. For anything I tell you about, if you're clever enough, you can probably tell me some kind of story that explains it in terms of self-interest, right? The soldier hopping on the grenade wanted to be remembered or something, right? Or he really did enjoy that 3 seconds so much. But that really doesn't prove very much, right? I mean, think of it this way, right? If I told you there was a little man who lived in my refrigerator and he's the one who turns the light on and off, if you gave me all kinds of evidence against it, I could always tell you some kind of story that explained it, right? I'd be like, you say, well, you never see him, and I'm like, well, he's invisible. And you say, well, look, here's the switch. If I tape it, the light goes off. And I say, well, that's just him. He's really clever. He's tricking us, right? Look, I can tell some kind of story, but they get increasingly ridiculous. You shouldn't take them seriously. The same goes for strong psychological egoism. Someone who wants to defend this can always tell some kind of story that explains actions in selfish terms, that doesn't mean that story is very plausible, right? At some point, you know, he only hops on the grenade because he wants to be a hero. At some point, those stories start to become as ridiculous as, all my excuses for why you can't see the little man who lives in my refrigerator, right? So, all of which is to say, strong psychological egoism, very interesting, but there's no good evidence for it. And there's lots of evidence against it. It would be interesting if strong psychological egoism were true. There's no good reason to think it is. Weak psychological egoism, true, but not that interesting. All right. So having talked about egoism, let's move on to the issue of cultural relativism.